Libra, let me ask you something, and answer it honestly. When was the last time you realized you weren't waiting anymore? You were holding your breath, holding space, holding peace, holding everyone else together, while quietly wondering how long you were supposed to stay suspended before something finally moved. Here's the part no one says out loud. When Libra goes silent, it's not weakness. It's a line being drawn. And right now, something around you can feel it. A message, a confirmation, a response that's been delayed just long enough to change the balance. If you felt that strange pressure in your chest, like something is about to shift but hasn't yet, leave a in the comments, just to acknowledge it. And ask yourself this: what if the next 72 hours aren't about forcing anything, but finally letting the truth respond to you? Take a breath. Trust what you've already sensed. Because once movement begins, Libra, it rarely stops where you expect. Libra, stay with me here. Before anything moves, there is always a moment no one talks about. The moment where you are still doing everything right on the outside. But something inside you has already gone quiet. Not empty, just still. You wake up. You answer messages. You show up where you said you would. And yet, there is this strange pause inside your chest. Like life has stopped inhaling, waiting to see if it is safe to exhale. I have seen this in Libra more times than I can count. Not because you lack courage, but because you carry an internal scale that never turns off. You weigh words before you speak them. You measure impact before you move. You consider how everyone else will land before you allow yourself to step forward. And from the outside, people call that patience, grace, maturity. But here is the part I want to tell you as a friend. Sometimes stillness is not wisdom. Sometimes it is exhaustion dressed in elegance. You have been standing in the middle for a long time, holding tension so no one else has to, absorbing delays, absorbing silence, absorbing unanswered questions. And you did it quietly, because that is what Libra does. You thought, if I stay calm a little longer, if I do not disrupt the balance, if I remain reasonable, something will eventually correct itself. But tell me honestly, when was the last time balance actually returned on its own? There is a difference between peace and postponement. And you felt it the moment your body stopped leaning forward. That moment when you no longer chased clarity. You did not demand it either. You simply stopped adjusting yourself to fit the delay. That is not giving up. That is a recalibration. Most people think change starts with action, but Libra knows better. Real movement begins when you stop compensating, when you stop smoothing over what feels off, when you stop translating other people's confusion into your responsibility. And something subtle happens then. The energy around you shifts position. Not dramatically, not loudly, just enough for the world to notice that you are no longer holding the weight alone. Have you felt that quiet tension recently? That sense that something is about to respond, not because you pushed, but because you finally stepped back? If you have, do not rush past it. Do not explain it away. Ask yourself this instead. What if this pause is not a delay, but the moment the balance begins to return to you? Take a slow breath here. Let the silence speak. Because once stillness stops being a sacrifice, it becomes a signal. And that is where the story truly begins. Libra, there is something about you most people never notice. You do not wait because you are unsure. You wait because you see too clearly. You notice the hesitation behind someone's words. You sense the fear underneath their delay. You understand the context they never explain. And because you understand, you soften. You slow yourself down. You give time, not as a sacrifice, but as a gesture of fairness. I want to say this gently, as someone who has watched you do this more times than you should have had to. You have a rare ability to hold two truths at the same time. You can acknowledge someone's struggle without dismissing your own needs. At least, you could. But somewhere along the way, something subtle shifted. You kept making room, and no one noticed the cost. Your calendar adjusted, your tone adapted, your expectations shrank. Not dramatically, quietly. That is how Libra exhaustion begins, not with anger, not with collapse, but with a deep, invisible tiredness that settles behind the eyes. You still show up polished. You still sound reasonable. You still tell yourself it is fine. But your body knows better. It knows the difference between patience that nourishes and patience that drains. And lately, you have been carrying more weight than the situation ever promised to return. Here is the part that matters. When Libra gets tired, the universe does not punish. It does not rush in with fireworks. It does not shout lessons. It responds by recalibrating. It begins to remove the cushion that kept things delayed. It lets silence become uncomfortable for the other side instead of you. You might not even notice it at first. Just a subtle shift. A pause that no longer feels mutual. A delay that starts to echo back to where it originated. That is not chaos. That is correction. Tell me something, Libra. Have you felt less inclined to explain yourself lately? Less willing to smooth over uncertainty? That is not indifference. That is alignment returning. You are not becoming colder. You are becoming clearer. And clarity, for you, is the most loving thing you can offer. To yourself. And to anyone who meets you honestly. There is a reason your waiting has reached its limit now. Not because you failed, but because you learned. You learned that balance cannot be sustained by one person leaning forever. And when that understanding settles in your chest, something else begins to stir. Not urgency, not pressure, movement. Soft at first, almost unnoticeable, like air shifting before a door opens. Stay with that feeling. Because once Libra stops carrying the weight alone, the response does not arrive loudly. It arrives precisely. And you are closer to that moment than you may realize. Libra, there is a moment I want you to remember. It is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is the moment you stop reaching. Not out of anger, not out of pride, but because something inside you quietly says, I have gone far enough. You may not have marked it on a calendar. You may not have announced it to anyone. But recently, you crossed an invisible line. You stopped repeating yourself. You stopped translating your needs into softer language. You stopped carrying someone else's timeline on your shoulders. And what matters most is this. You did not do it to make a point. You did it because your energy asked for honesty. This is something very few people understand about Libra. Your boundaries are not walls. They are calibrations. You do not slam doors. You adjust distance. You do not cut people off. You stop leaning. And when you stopped leaning, the entire structure around you had to rebalance. Here is the truth I want to offer you as a friend. The moment you stopped, rescuing the process, you allowed reality to reveal itself. You let silence speak. You let delay stand on its own. You let responsibility return to where it belonged. That takes more courage than any confrontation ever could. Because it means trusting that clarity does not require force. It only requires space. You may have felt a strange mix of emotions when you did this. Relief, guilt, calm, and a quiet fear. What if I lose the connection? What if I seem distant? What if I am misunderstood? But here is what you probably noticed next. Nothing collapsed. In fact, something subtle began to shift. The air felt different. Conversations slowed down. Energy no longer rushed toward you for answers. That is not abandonment. That is balance restoring itself. Let me ask you something gently. Have you noticed how much lighter your chest feels when you stop explaining what should already be clear? That lightness is not detachment. It is alignment. Libra, you are not here to not maintain harmony by absorbing imbalance. You are here to reflect truth until harmony becomes mutual. And when you draw that invisible line, the universe does not react immediately. It recalculates. It gives others the chance to feel the weight they handed to you. That is why things begin to move after you stop moving first. Not because you demanded change, but because you stopped buffering discomfort. This is where the story deepens. Because once the line is drawn, even quietly, responses can no longer hide behind delay. You do not need to watch for signs. You do not need to wait anxiously. Just notice what approaches you now without being chased. There is a reason movement begins this way. Soft, precise, unavoidable. And as you stand here, grounded in your own center, you may sense it already. Something is preparing to meet you where you finally chose to stand. Let us stay right here for a moment. Because what comes next does not arrive with noise. It arrives with momentum. Libra, let's slow this down together. Because the moment after a line is drawn is often misunderstood. People expect fireworks, announcements, something dramatic to justify the shift. But what actually comes next is quieter than that, and far more powerful. Those 72 hours you keep hearing about, they are not a countdown. They are not a test. They are the natural response of momentum finally being released. Think of it like this. For a long time, you were the stabilizer, the one absorbing pressure, the one keeping things from tipping too far in any direction. And when you stepped back, even slightly, the system had to correct itself. Not emotionally, mechanically. Momentum does not ask permission. It does not negotiate. It simply moves when resistance is no longer doing the work for everyone else. That is why what approaches you now feels almost casual. A message that sounds simple. An email that does not over-explain. A call that finally says what should have been said earlier. Nothing poetic about it. Nothing mystical on the surface. And yet you feel it immediately. Because relief is not excitement. Relief is the body recognizing that it no longer has to brace. You may notice your shoulders drop before your mind catches up. Your breathing deepen without effort. That is how you know this is real. Not because something incredible happened, but because something heavy stopped happening. Here is an insight I want to share with you as a friend. Momentum only shows up after clarity has been respected. And clarity came the moment you stopped softening your truth to protect someone else from discomfort. That is why things move now without you chasing them. This is not the universe rewarding patience. It is the universe responding to alignment. You did not force progress. You made room for it. And here is the part that matters most, especially for you. When Libra no longer carries the delay, movement does not arrive with urgency. It arrives with precision. Exactly what needs to respond does. Nothing extra, nothing overwhelming, just enough to restore balance where it was missing. Ask yourself this quietly. What feels different about the way this reaches you compared to everything you waited for before? Notice the absence of anxiety, the lack of tension in your decision-making, the ease with which you receive it. That ease is not accidental. It is the result of momentum meeting you where you finally stood still. And as this movement settles, you may sense another layer opening. Not louder, deeper. Because once momentum begins, it does not rush forward blindly. It reveals what has been ready all along. Stay present here. The next shift does not come from motion, but from what clarity allows you to see. Libra. This is the part people rarely prepare you for. After the momentum begins, after the pressure releases, there is a moment that feels almost ordinary. No announcement, no dramatic apology, no long explanation trying to rewrite the past. Just a message. And that is exactly why it matters. Because real relief does not arrive loudly. It arrives quietly enough that only someone who has been holding their breath can feel it. You read the words once, then again. Not because they are confusing, but because your nervous system needs time to realize the waiting is over. There is something deeply human about this moment. It is not about being chosen. It is not about being right. It is about the body finally receiving a clear signal. Yes, this is confirmed. This is acknowledged. This is moving. And you exhale. Not the shallow kind of breath you take to stay composed. The real one. The kind that drops your shoulders and softens your jaw before your mind even forms a thought. I want to say this to you as a friend. Relief is not excitement. Relief is safety returning. It is the absence of tension you had grown so used to you forgot it was optional. You did not need an apology because you were not waiting for validation. You were waiting for clarity. You did not need a grand promise because you were not asking for fantasy. You were asking for truth. And truth does not need decoration. It only needs to be spoken. That is why this message feels different from everything you hoped for before. It does not pull you forward. It meets you where you already are. Have you noticed that? How there is no rush inside you now, no urge to overthink, no need to respond immediately just to maintain harmony. That is not indifference. That is relief doing its work. You are no longer bracing for disappointment. You are no longer negotiating with uncertainty. And here is the insight I want you to hold gently. Relief arrives when waiting ends, not when winning begins. This moment is not about outcome. It is about release. Release from the mental loops. Release from the emotional buffering. Release from being the one who keeps things afloat. You did not change the situation by force. You changed it by stopping the weight. And that is a quiet kind of power. Let me ask you something softly. What does it feel like to receive something without having to chase it? Notice that feeling. The simplicity of it. The steadiness. Because that steadiness is where the next layer opens, not with more movement, but with what this clarity now allows you to build. Stay right here with me. There is more light ahead, and it does not require effort to reach. Libra. Now notice what happens next. Not outside of you, inside. Clarity does something very specific to your energy. It does not excite you, it steadies you. The moment things are named honestly, your mind stops circling. Your body stops preparing for impact. Your heart no longer has to lean in two directions at once. And suddenly, you move, not impulsively, not dramatically, efficiently. This is something I admire deeply about you. When Libra knows where they stand, there is no wasted motion. You do not rush ahead. You do not hesitate behind. You simply place your feet on solid ground. Plans that felt impossible to organize start arranging themselves naturally. Not because the world became easier, but because your internal noise went quiet. Money feels different now, not magically larger, just clearer. You see what belongs where, what needs attention, what no longer deserves your worry. Family conversations soften, not because everyone suddenly agrees, but because you are no longer absorbing tension to keep the peace, and that changes the room. Here is an insight I want to offer you, one that rarely gets talked about. Progress does not begin when circumstances improve. It begins when ambiguity ends. For you, uncertainty has always been heavier than effort. You can work hard, you can compromise, you can adjust. What drains you is not knowing where you stand. And now, you do. That is why movement feels smooth instead of forced. That is why decisions no longer feel emotional. They feel grounded. Have you noticed how your inner dialogue has shifted? Less justification, less rehearsal, more quiet certainty. That is alignment taking shape. You are no longer negotiating with yourself. You are responding to reality as it is. And here is where the healing deepens. When Libra stops splitting their energy, the nervous system begins to trust again. Trust your timing. Trust your instincts. Trust that you do not need to overcorrect to maintain balance. You are not choosing sides now. You are choosing center. Let me ask you something gently. What feels easier today that used to feel complicated just days ago? Sit with that answer for a moment. Because ease is not laziness. It is a sign that you are no longer fighting yourself. And that creates momentum that does not burn you out. This is the kind of progress that builds instead of consumes. And as this steadiness settles in, you may notice something unexpected. A lightness. Not excitement. Not celebration yet. Just a quiet sense that you are finally moving forward without leaving yourself behind. Stay with that feeling. Because when clarity holds long enough, it naturally makes space for something gentler to arrive. Not urgency, not pressure, but a moment worth savoring. And you are closer to that moment than you think. Libra. This is where the energy softens. After clarity settles, after progress finds its rhythm, there is a quieter moment that follows. One that doesn't ask for witnesses. You don't announce it. You don't post about it. You don't even name it out loud. You just feel it. The relief has done its work. The movement is steady. And now, something inside you exhales into peace. Your kind of celebration has never been loud. It has always been intimate. It looks like choosing a meal you actually want, not the one that keeps everyone else comfortable. It feels like sleeping through the night without waking up to replay old conversations. It sounds like a small breath of laughter when you realize how much tension you were carrying without ever calling it heavy. This is something I want you to hear as a friend. Celebration doesn't always mean success. Sometimes it means return. Returning to your own center. Returning to your own pace. Returning to the part of you that doesn't need to explain itself. You don't need applause for this moment. Because it isn't about proving anything. It's about recognizing yourself again. Libra, you are often celebrated by others for your grace, your fairness, your ability to make things work. But this celebration is different. It is quiet acknowledgement. You held the balance long enough. You drew the line without force. You allowed clarity to arrive on its own terms. And now you get to rest in the result. Have you noticed how your body responds to that rest? The way your thoughts slow down. The way your decisions feel less charged. That's not complacency. That's alignment settling in. This kind of joy doesn't sparkle. It glows. It shows up in ordinary moments that suddenly feel spacious again, in conversations that don't require strategy, in choices that feel obvious instead of heavy. And there is something deeply healing about that. Because for so long, you were measuring yourself against what was expected, what was fair, what was reasonable. Now you are simply present. Let me ask you something gently. When was the last time you allowed yourself to enjoy a moment without explaining why it was deserved? Sit with that question for a second, because this is the kind of celebration that teaches you something important. You don't need chaos to feel alive. You don't need struggle to feel valuable. You don't need resolution to be dramatic, to be meaningful. Peace can be enough. And as you rest here, as this calm confidence settles into your bones, another realization begins to surface. Not as a thought, as a knowing, this version of you doesn't go back to overextending, doesn't return to waiting in discomfort, doesn't forget what balance actually feels like. And that knowing quietly shapes what you allow next. Stay in this moment a little longer, because what follows this kind of celebration is not noise, not urgency, it's wisdom. And it begins to guide you long before you realize you've stepped into a new chapter. Libra. This is the lesson that stays with you. Not the kind you write down, not the kind you explain to others, the kind that settles quietly and changes how you stand in the world. You didn't learn this lesson through conflict. You didn't learn it by being louder. You learned it by noticing what happened when you stopped overextending your grace. For a long time, you believed fairness required sacrifice, that keeping peace meant absorbing discomfort, that if you stayed calm long enough, the imbalance would eventually correct itself. But this experience showed you something gentler and far more powerful. You do not need to upset anyone to be treated with respect. You do not need to argue your worth to be met halfway. Sometimes all that is required is knowing when to stop compensating. That realization changes how silence feels. Before, silence felt like a test, something to endure, something to explain away. Now, it feels like information. You notice when conversations stall, when responses drift, when energy goes quiet without clarity. And instead of tightening, instead of waiting longer than necessary, you listen. Because you understand now that prolonged silence is not always patience. Sometimes it is a sign that you have been standing in the wrong place. This is not about walking away. It is about repositioning. There is a difference. Libra, your gift has always been balance. But balance does not mean staying still. It means adjusting weight before strain turns into damage. This lesson teaches you that movement does not have to be dramatic to be decisive. It can be as simple as pausing your effort, as quiet as redirecting your attention, as subtle as no longer filling the space someone else left empty. And something remarkable happens when you do that. The world responds differently. People reveal their capacity. Situations clarify themselves, not because you demanded answers, but because you stopped shielding others from the consequences of their delay. Let me ask you something softly. What would change in your life if you trusted your sense of timing as much as you trust your sense of fairness? Sit with that question for a moment, because this is the wisdom you carry forward. Not suspicion, not hardness, but discernment. You learn to recognize when waiting is loving, and when it is self-abandonment. You learn to honor your intuition without rushing it, to respect your boundaries without announcing them. And most importantly, you learn that you are allowed to move when stillness no longer feels truthful. This does not make you less kind. It makes your kindness sustainable. As you step into what comes next, you will notice yourself checking in differently, listening more closely to your body, responding sooner to quiet signals. That is growth. Quiet, integrated, lasting. And as this understanding settles into you, it opens the door to a new kind of chapter, one where balance is shared, where clarity arrives sooner, where your energy flows without being divided. You do not need to rush toward it, just keep standing where you are now, centered, aware, ready. Because from here on, Libra, your movement is guided not by pressure, but by truth. And that is a journey worth taking slowly. Libra. Before we close this space, let me ask you something gently. What shifted inside you when you stopped waiting and started listening? Not to the noise, to the pause. Here's a small observation you may have missed. The moment things began to move, your body relaxed before your mind did. That tells you something important. Your truth often arrives quietly first. So for a few seconds after this video ends, do nothing. No scrolling, no thinking ahead. Just sit in the silence and notice where your breath naturally settles. That is your inner balance point. Here is a simple inner exercise. Tonight, write down one place in your life where you are still explaining when no explanation is needed. You don't have to act on it yet, just name it. Awareness is already movement. I'll share something personal with you. There was a time I thought peace meant staying. I learned slowly that peace sometimes means shifting one step to the side and letting the world meet you there. Libra, you are not late. You are not behind. You are arriving exactly when clarity does. If this message found you at the right moment, leave a comment. Even a single word is enough. It helps this space stay alive. And if you feel called, subscribe. Not out of habit, but because you trust where this journey is going. Take this with you. You don't need to announce your next move. You only need to feel it. The journey continues. The next message is already forming. Until then, trust yourself.